Thanks, Jack. Just out of interest, who's heard of blockchain? A few. Who's heard of Bitcoin? And who doesn't like putting their hands up at conferences? A few people. Before I start, I want to make a clear segregation between what Bitcoin is and what blockchain is. Now, we've heard a lot about them in a very similar context, so I want to make that segregation clear. Now, Bitcoin is what they call a cyber or a digital currency, known as a cryptocurrency. Now, what underlies the security behind Bitcoin, between transferring Bitcoin from one investor to another, is its underlying blockchain technology. So there is a bit of a difference there. Now, blockchain was brought into the centre of the hype and excitement last year. A lot of the rise of Bitcoin. We saw the price of one Bitcoin go from under $1,000 to over 18,000 US dollars. And at that point, there were many thinking that Bitcoin was their unicorn, having heavily invested in Bitcoin, made a lot of money, exited their jobs and became full-time cryptocurrency traders. And I think there's a bit of a parallel there too with blockchain. And from our point of view, we certainly don't consider blockchain to be a silver bullet. It's got some really strong value propositions in particular parts of the supply chain. And I want to go a bit more into that today. Before I start, I want to introduce myself. So I'm Wes Lefroy, for those of you who haven't met, and my role within Rabobank. So I'm a member of the Rabo Research Food and Agri team, and I'm one of 90 analysts right across the world, working on a variety of sectors, including animal proteins, dairy, farm inputs, cotton, sugar, wool, grains and oilseeds. So me personally, I work in the grains and oilseeds sector, and also farm inputs, working on ag technology and fertiliser. And really it's our role in communication with our global colleagues to understand what's happening on the global market, what's happening with global trends, linking that back to a local context, and then ultimately delivering that knowledge to the farm gate. But not only knowledge, insight and foresight. Where do we see these trends and markets moving in the future? So I am here today to talk about blockchain and what it means for the NT cattle producer. But I wanted to start off by giving blockchain a bit of context. I consider blockchain to be a little bit like the internet. In order to extract value out of it, you don't necessarily need to know the inner workings and the inner coding behind how blockchain works. So I wanted to start off by talking about three stories. The first story I want to talk about is growing consumer demand for food safety, transparency and provenance in the supply chain. The second story I want to talk about is the rise of online shopping, which is giving consumers access to products that have their desired attributes. And then I want to talk a little bit more about how technology is bringing greater financial efficiency and how blockchain is related to that. I'll then talk more about what blockchain is, and then I'll also finally talk about how can the producers and also the industry respond. So, as I said, the first story that we're seeing is a rising opportunity to sell premium food. And really, it's that greater demand from consumers for food safety, transparency and provenance. So for those of you who haven't heard the word provenance, essentially it's proving the origin of a product. The example I want to talk about, and particularly in China and Asia, is the melamine crisis, where over 300,000 infants in China were infected with melamine. 54,000 of those children ended up in hospital as a result of melamine being put into locally sourced infant baby powder. As a result, we've seen a price premium grow between locally sourced infant baby powder and also imported powder, which now has a much stronger reputation around food safety. In the future with blockchain, we expect that consumer preferences will become a lot more precise. So rather than just being related to local versus imported, they can be related to a particular country, a particular region, or even a particular product attribute. I also want to make it clear at this point that there is technologies and tools that do trace products through the supply chain. But the real strength of blockchain is the strength of the verification of that information along the supply chain. So not only now are we delivering transparency, provenance, and information about food safety to the consumer, we're delivering it safely, but also very securely, where essentially it can't be defrauded or changed along the supply chain. Consumer preferences are also going beyond health and also much more towards the environment. So you might have read in the news at the moment, the EU Commission's put forward a proposal to ban palm oil imports from Malaysia and Indonesia. A few quick facts about palm oil production. 90% of all palm oil in the world originates from Malaysia and Indonesia, of which 55% of that goes into the EU. So this is certainly not a small decision by any stretch. This decision was made off the back of concerns about sustainability of palm oil production in those two countries, and also concerns about farmer welfare. And what we also know from the glyphosate issues that we saw at the end of last year, where in the 11th hour, glyphosate use was mandated again for another 5 years in the EU, that it's becoming much more about perception than it is the science. So we saw glyphosate pass every single scientific test put through within that process. But still there were concerns about the safety of glyphosate. So with a world-class animal welfare system here in Australia, and also the fact that we have a very low use of synthetic fertilisers, the opportunity here for NT cattle producers and cattle producers more broadly is to really link this story up with the consumer, really sell off the back of our sustainability, our environmental regulation, our welfare regulation as well, and deliver that into premium markets, creating more value. Blockchain is a tool that can help to deliver this message. The second story I want to talk about is that consumers have greater access. More consumers are buying their food online. And essentially, this is giving them greater access to their desired product attributes. In China alone, we've seen year on year from 2012 to 2016, the year-on-year growth of e-commerce sales around 40%, dropping slightly in 2017. We see this in three main forms. The first one is meal kits. So some of you might have heard of Marley Spoon or even HelloFresh. I actually ordered this a couple of weeks ago, and we literally ordered our meals for the week on an app. So we had all the ingredients listed out of what was in each product, and it was a nutritional content as well, and it was all delivered directly to our front door. Now, whether we're actually going to do that again after it was stolen off our doorstep the second time we ordered it is another question, but this is just an example of how consumers are buying more food online. The second one is restaurant delivery. So once again, many of you might have heard of Uber Eats, Menulog or Foodora. So rather than going into a restaurant and reading off a menu, consumers are more and more going and looking on an app, looking for nutritional content, ingredients and the like. And finally, the third component of this is delivered groceries. And this certainly isn't anything new. Walmart and also Kroger have been doing this for over 25 years in the US, but it's really come into focus last year with Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods for $13.7 billion. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Whole Foods market, it's essentially a premium, high-end food, organic, really tapping into that high-end value. And Amazon's trying to tap into this market online. So to essentially deliver premium food with that organic story, that really high-end health, environment story directly to the consumer. I also wanted to share this story with you. So earlier this year, you might have read in the news that a ship of cattle left Australia and headed to China. And this has been sent through from our Chinese animal protein analyst that we work with quite a bit. So many of you would have heard of the app WhatsApp. So essentially, this is the Chinese version called WeChat. So at the top here, we have, and please excuse my Mandarin, so I'm definitely relying on our Chinese animal protein analyst for that. But we've got premium Australian beef at the top, as it's labelled, 5 kilos of premium Australian beef being sold on a mainstream digital application in China. Underneath, we've got the equivalent Chinese product, less than half the price of the Australian premium product. So this is an example of premium Australian beef being sold online with a number of product attributes straight to consumers. How this might look like in the future, and once again, I acknowledge there are traceability technologies at the moment working through the supply chain, but I wanted to share this with you from the future market. So where they've mapped out what transferring chicken on a blockchain might look like. So essentially what we've got on the label is a whole host of information and product attributes, including from the hatchery, we've got location, birth date, species, health status, date arrived, date departed. And then on the farm, we've got location, feed type, vaccinations, antibiotics, environment, treatment, health status, starting weight. So we've got a comprehensive level of information for consumers to make their purchasing decisions on. And the fact that it was all transferred on a blockchain has delivered the security and verified that that information has been passed through the supply chain without being altered. The third story that we're seeing is technologies enabling greater level of financial efficiency. By its very nature, blockchain essentially can check when a transaction is made that finance is available before a transaction proceeds. So essentially reducing counterparty risk. It also can make near instant payments. So if I deliver my cattle straight on a blockchain, I get the finance straight away. So with that, there's a lot happening in trade dynamics at the moment, as you would have read in the news. So there is parties that we can never trade with because we essentially don't trust them enough to get paid. So where we have two parties in a supply, both on a blockchain that essentially don't trust each other to get paid, the blockchain can facilitate that transaction, essentially allowing the transaction to proceed. This is for both international trade and transactions domestically. This second point is why a lot of big companies are looking at the use of blockchain. So at the moment, there might be a lot of back office staff in big companies that reconcile payments. Blockchain has the ability to be able to automate and digitise this process. So it's essentially done without the use of back office staff. And the final point is self-executing smart contracts. So smart contracts are the layer that sit on top of a blockchain. So when a commodity is bought to the point of sale, the contract which is entered into the blockchain essentially executes that sale and allocates the commodity to a purchaser and sends the finance back in the other way. So there we have the three key themes of blockchain. Firstly, consumers are increasing their demand for transparency and provenance, which blockchain can assist to bring information that's been verified along the supply chain. Secondly, online shopping is giving consumers greater access to products with desired attributes. And finally, the opportunity for greater financial efficiency. So with those stories in mind, I now want to explain what blockchain is. When we think about agtech and innovation within agriculture, quite often an innovation or technology will be focused on an individual segment of the supply chain, whether that be on consumers, whether that be on processors, or whether that be on a digital marketplace, for example. Blockchain is different. Blockchain focuses on the interaction between each of those stakeholders along the supply chain. So blockchain essentially is a digital platform that stores and verifies the transactions between users. It securely facilitates the transfer of commodities, so it could be beef, wool, grain, fertiliser, you name it, anything. Finance going back in the other direction instantly, but also production data. So the associated production data. So that could be chemical inputs, vaccine, drench, you name it. That can be put in the blockchain as well. Transactions or blocks are recorded on a shared record book, or what is also known as a shared ledger. Individual entities, such as growers or processors, own their own copy of the ledger, which is connected to thousands of other ledgers across the network. When a transaction is made, a new record or block is created and verified by the network and added to the blockchain. This enables secure and near instant interactions between businesses. Critical to the blockchain is that each block is encrypted and is a non-replicable digital record. It cannot be deleted, reversed, or edited. Only a new entry that is validated by entities on the chain can alter the blockchain. So this is what a blockchain supply chain could look like. So rather than having, and I'll show it in a minute, a traditional supply chain going straight down, we've now got each entity on the supply chain connected through the use of the blockchain network and the shared ledger network. So at each point with the orange arrows, we've got the physical commodity moving around, finance going the other direction, and production data at each point by each stakeholder being entered into the blockchain. And essentially, once that information is in there and verified by the blockchain, it cannot be changed, removed, or defrauded. So the consumer at the end can essentially see everything that's happened to that product until the point that it's got to the consumer, but also producers can see the end market and see downstream as well. So there is a little bit of alterations to traditional supply chains. So let's look at it from an aspect of a producer who will sell, say, their cattle to a feedlot. And then depending on the terms, the finance will go back in 30, 60, or 90 days, and so on and so forth down the supply chain. Now, at each point in this supply chain, there's essentially a central point, or someone who's verifying the transaction has taken place, which could be someone like a bank who's actually facilitating this transaction. This is known as a centralised supply chain. The other point that I want to make is that when it comes to production data moving down the supply chain, that it relies on each person or each stakeholder in the supply chain to accurately pass that information on. So that can be easily changed, or information can be inaccurately communicated between party A and party B. So there is a lot of element of trust with information going down that supply chain. As I mentioned before, transactions on a blockchain are verified by all users. So we've got the physical commodity moving around, the network, everyone on the network is linked together essentially on that blockchain, bringing transparency, provenance, and reduction in counterparty risk. I also want to make the point again that this is a two-way data feedback. So producers at the top of the supply chain have a view of what's happening downstream and can get market feedback. I'll be talking about that a little bit more in a minute. Now, there is a couple of downfalls to this, and I'm only going to talk about a couple that mainly focus on what producers can do, but there's a lot of other downfalls in terms of who's going to orchestrate the development of blockchain with all the inner coding and all that sort of stuff. But I wanted to highlight two main issues today, and that is the first one is an element of human trust still exists. But for those of you who've heard of the Internet of Things, essentially what the Internet of Things is a network of devices or sensors that collect data and share data among that network. So essentially we're automating data collection to be put into the supply chain. So for instance, where we have a breeder or a calf cow operator, input data such as genetics, fertilisers and chemicals can be automatically recorded and put straight into the blockchain. So rather than a human entering that information into the blockchain, it's now being automated by the Internet of Things and sensors. And so on and so forth for the background of fattener and also the feedlot. So in a perfect system, we would have everyone on a blockchain automatically entering data into that blockchain, which is the most secure possibility. The second main downfall that I want to mention is that all supply chain stakeholders must be on the blockchain. So for instance, if we don't have a processor, or we don't have a feedlotter, or we don't have an exporter on the blockchain, essentially that's a black hole undermining the integrity of that blockchain. So we've lost track of who's in possession of that commodity, the value that they're adding, the information that they're adding, and also the finance transfers can't be facilitated by that blockchain. So through the development of blockchain, it's really important that the development downstream is happening at the same speed as it is upstream. So we're seeing a lot of development at the moment from downstream, such as a lot of the e-commerce companies and supermarkets. But a question I'm going to ask in a minute is, who's driving that for producers? So 2017 was the year of Bitcoin. Last year we saw more than 50 test cases of blockchain alone in trade and commodity finance. And we also saw a lot happening more broadly in food and agriculture. A couple that I want to talk about is the Global Food Safety Project being led by IBM. So we've seen companies like Nestle, Unilever and Tyson, and also Walmart have teamed up to try and create this global food safety uniform blockchain. You might have read about in the last couple of months, JD.com, who are the second biggest e-commerce platform in the world, are taking beef from a producer in Tasmania on a blockchain to China. Rabobank, in partnership with AgriDigital, who are a blockchain startup, did a trade and commodity finance proof of concept transaction whereby the grower of grain got their money instantly on delivery, and then the buyer paid after the agreed payment terms. But also particularly in the grain space, we're seeing a lot of development off the back of tightened competition, particularly in Southeast Asian export markets. So once again, the startup AgriDigital, who are focused on the grain supply chains, in partnership with CBH, did a pilot actually at Blue Lake Milling, whereby they were tracking oats into Vietnam. The other one I just want to mention quickly as well, for those of you who saw on Beef Central this morning, the announcement of a platform whereby beef is being tracked from Australia straight to consumers in China, and Chinese consumers can actually take some sort of ownership of those cows as they're in Australia. So I think that's certainly one to watch out for. And I was talking to the CEO in New Zealand on Tuesday, and it's a really interesting project, and I encourage you to all keep across that. So there we have it, the three stories shaping the food and agriculture landscape for blockchain. What is blockchain? And finally, I want to talk now about how producers and the industry can respond. So let's take a look at it from the producer's side of things. Firstly, we see a couple of impacts. Firstly is that digitally collected data is shared down the supply chain. So that's the more data being put into the supply chain and onto the blockchain, the stronger that story is, the better that we can paint that production story. Secondly, because we're getting more feedback about consumer markets, we can identify opportunities that we couldn't previously. So production decisions can be now more demand-driven than supply-driven. Secondly, the relationships with supply chain stakeholders will also change. New relationships are now possible where they previously weren't because of counterparty risk. Logistics can now be more easily optimised because of more transparency in the supply chain. Things like artificial intelligence can be linked into better analyse logistics and optimise logistics. And I've talked about greater back office efficiency with reconciliation of payments. From the bank's perspective, the move towards automated finance, production and financial data can be integrated. And then in terms of farmers' relationship, producers' relationship with the end user, transparency and provenance can bring opportunities for producers to link directly with consumers and really strengthen that production story, not only on food safety and health, but the environment and animal welfare. Now, let's take a little bit more look at what this two-way data flow could look like. So I've talked a lot about data out and producers adding data onto the blockchain about the production of their beef or their animals. I've talked about automated data collection will strengthen the story with the Internet of Things and sensors. I got asked the other day, what type of data will end users want? What type of data do we need to add into the blockchain? And I think that really depends on who the end user is. Is it a restaurant trying to frame your product in a particular way or on a menu against other products? Is it an online platform where you're really reaching for that premium market? Or is it your supermarket like Coles and Woolworths, who you're going against the Coles brand or the local home brand? Now, from the data in feedback type side of things, where there is now a view of where your product is going, consumer demand, really helping to identify opportunities that previously weren't identifiable. we see producers will be able to move from being supply-driven, focusing on their supply, to being more reactive to demand and identifying opportunities from the demand side of things. We see 3 key focus points from this side of things. The first thing is predictability, removing that production risk in instances where excess supply has hampered the market or excess demand has left consumers and exporters short. This will now be able to create stronger relationships with trade partners, leading to longer term agreements, ultimately strengthening that relationship with the supply chain and also consumers. The second one is productive improvement. So I've talked about the opportunity to see things that previously we couldn't. So for example, is there more value in the market if you deliver 2 weeks later, 2 weeks earlier? If you deliver a slightly smaller animal or slightly bigger animal, if you deliver an animal with more fat, more muscle, less fat, less muscle. This is more identifiable on a blockchain. And the third key point is the flexibility of production. So being able to adapt to these demands and trying to optimise that market value within your own operation. And this not only comes down to the labour force that you got, but also the technology that you have available and the resources that you have available to do this. Now, from the industry side of things, participants will be called on to do their bit, and we certainly acknowledge that there's going to be costs in the short term before benefits are reached, but we do think over time, in the medium term, that these benefits will certainly outweigh the initial costs. So at the moment, we've got governments investing in blockchain, we've got corporates, as I've talked about with JD.com and Walmart, for example, investing in blockchain. We've got startups working on blockchain, Ripe.io in the horticulture and food safety, Agridigital in the grain space. Some of you might have also heard of Beef Ledger, working in Queensland on the beef side of things. Rabobank and other banks are working from a finance perspective on blockchain. But the question I want to leave you with today, who is driving the agenda for producers? We're seeing a lot of development downstream from supermarkets at the consumer end, but who's making sure producers are linked in? Who's making sure producers have the right to enter in these premium markets on a blockchain? Who's making sure they have the capacity to operate? So in summary, blockchain is a digital platform that stores and verifies transactions between users. It facilitates the secure transfer of commodities such as beef, wool, grain, finance and associated data. The key benefits are transparency, provenance, and the reduction of counterparty risk, and also financial efficiency. In our view, we'll see farmers go from being supply-driven to more demand-driven, and a continued emphasis on data collection. From the industry perspective, participants will be called on to play their part in the implementation. And the challenge I want to leave you with today, who is going to drive that agenda for producers? Who is going to make sure that they have the right to operate, that you guys have the right to operate in these markets? So with that, I encourage you to tune into our podcast channel. Angus, our animal protein analyst, uploaded a podcast on Tuesday on beef trade. There's also going to be one coming up from the NTCA Conference with Angus and Barry as well. So I encourage you, while you're driving, to tune into our Rabo Research podcast channel. Thanks.